Hi, my name is Thomas Asmuth. I work and teach at the University of West Florida Department of Art and Design. I'm here today with my colleague Sara. Sara, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Sara Gevurtz, and I'm with Auburn University.
Thank you for this opportunity to present with the ASLE. In the past 5 years, we have produced many works using ecological fieldwork and assemblage as a merger of art and sciences. Our work looks at how ecological conditions are communicated. In question are abstract visualization of data points and graphing that are normally associated with that kind of work. We're critical of the separation of the phenomenological and data and how this creates a psychic separation for most people. What is the role of a transdisciplinary artist in the age of ecological crises and cynicism? We're two artists who mix art and science in the midst of these overwhelming crises. Our talk is titled Eco-Art and Sciences in an Age of Cynicism. The case for our planet is grim. No wonder cynicism abounds. The authors of a 2019 research article named How Fast Are the Oceans Warming present evidence that the world seas are warming up to 40% faster than calculated by a study 5 years earlier. And other evidence includes the massive coral die-offs due to ocean warming and acidification, NOAA's studies which reported that 2014 to 2018 as the warmest period in the previous 140 years, NOAA's prediction of rapidly increasing numbers and intensities of tropical cyclones in conjunction with global warming effect. In August of 2019, Russian scientists reported that massive releases of methane were emerging from the Siberian Sea permafrost. This is very troubling. Methane in the atmosphere is 25 times more powerful than CO2 at trapping heat. The warmer the planet becomes, the more methane is released and thus the cycle accelerates. This brief survey sets the backdrop for the 21st century. Anthropogenically induced climate change should not surprise anyone. Global warming was predicted in the 1820s by French physicist Joseph Fourier. Tyndall and Arrhenius picked up on Fourier's greenhouse analogy just a few decades later and empirically demonstrated that small amounts of carbon dioxide and water vapor in the atmosphere were creating blanketing effects. Meteorological monitoring, begun in 1958 by Charles David Keeling, is a living record of the increasing greenhouse gas in our atmosphere. Contemporary willful ignorance against all these observations, predictions, and outcomes is a culture war, and that's not new, but it makes me ask why. Global warming is an unimaginably large crisis that will play out over centuries. As a so-called hyperobject, the scale of it dwarfs human experience, like the portion of an iceberg below the waterline. Perhaps we can gain some understanding from a very present crisis to consider how these culture wars and cynicisms pervade. Mistrust is fomented as a conflict of science and politics in the COVID-19 pandemic. Politics and economy are being pitted against public health and scientific fact. The lack of literacy for some and others' willful ignorance about the contagion is entangled with conspiracy theories. Those stories are an attempt to construct a simplified, unitary narrative to explain away a crisis which in actuality is an unnervingly complex at heart. And thus something as obvious as wearing a mask to slow the transmission becomes a controversial act. We live in an age of crises and cynicisms brought to bear by misinterpretations, magical thinking, and fears over fact. Despite the call for fundamental societal and system transitions and transformations in the 2018 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, the efforts to address climatic issues continue to be woefully underfunded. Very few coordinated and substantial reforms by corporate, political, or institutional entities have been adopted to address human or financial hazards. The reticence of government and institutional actors have driven individuals to take action, and this becomes more complicated with the trend of contemporary political radicalism. In addition to her analysis of the damage that deregulation has contributed to the crisis, Naomi Klein, the author of On Fire, The Burning Case for a Green New Deal, documents ecological entanglements with radical ideologies. She reports on Brenton Tarrant, aka the Christchurch Killer, who referred to his philosophy and motivation as eco-fascism. She also introduces Norwegian Anders Breivik, the far-right Norwegian, who carried out a mass killing in 2011. He approached it from a different facet, calling for an action against eco-communism. Both of these approaches are fascinating political inversions of the eco-terrorists or eco-warriors of the 20th century. Movements like Earth First sought to unseat corporate hierarchies which they held responsible for the ecological disaster. Earth First called for dismantling of power structures, but the eco-fascist version focuses on the realization of apartheid and exclusionary philosophies to return to purity. Less violent and destructive individual, grassroots, and small organizational efforts have also emerged as various forms of the eco-humanities in this vacuum. New forms have started to coalesce, demonstrating a significant individual awareness and frustration on the impotence of institutional actors. Crisis often manifests as novel forms of artwork. These are attempts to reconcile human fears, hopes, and ambitions, now of the changing planet. Climate fiction, or cli-fi, is that spin-off of speculative fiction or science fiction genres. Whether or not watching a horror film is going to actually create the impetus to make massive political and socio-economic change is still up for debate, but it seems to signal the urgency to act is on our conscience. The emergent social science to study ecologically influenced grief is an example of a newly developing eco-humanities practice. Rituals of mourning for an individual who has experienced a direct and acute event, like a wildfire or hurricane, is markedly better understood than the generalized condition of trying to cope with massive environmental change. Kunsolo and Ellis argue that the nature of these changes will require a new understanding of our relationship to the biosphere and new coping strategies. Anthropogenic pollution is causing rapid warming of our planet. The unsustainable practices of predation of nature have critically stressed our biomes, and some respective scholars say it's too late to avoid nature's cataclysm. But I'd like to correct the record. There is not an ecological crisis. The problem is a human crisis. I assure you that nature will persist. Barring an extreme cosmological event, albeit nature has even survived those before, the planet has billions of years to go. Life will persist, it will evolve, and undoubtedly other species will be able to survive the conditions we fashioned. Evidence of evolutionary adaptations from human pressures may already be appearing. In 2016, Japanese researchers discovered a strain of bacteria in a landfill that can consume plastics with an enzyme never previously known. And one very queer and ironic fact is that reinforces this persistence of nature is that the rise of primates coincided with an extreme global cooling cycle, which spelled the extinction of many other species.
The questions for this treatise are, what is the artist's role when this is the backdrop in which we work? And in the light of the hypocrisies of humanity on this issue, why continue to work? Isn't it futile? In the past 5 years, we have worked on a string of eco-art projects loosely connected under the title Turbidity Paintings. As the principal investigators, we collaborate with a team of scientists, other artists, environmental activists, and interns to conduct interdisciplinary field expeditions to study the conditions in waterways. The collaboration has led to the creation of new methods and tools, including custom field equipment, open source monitoring, electronics, ROVs, and more. These tools and processes are used to document water quality in a variety of methods, including images, video, geophysical data, and samples, which are collected in order to run complicated analysis procedures for future use. Most of these investigations have been on the Gulf of Mexico and in Northwest Florida waterways, but we have taken the opportunity when possible to conduct short-term studies of water in western New York State, the Indian Ocean, South Africa, and Korea. From the foundational philosophy to the outcomes, for example, exhibits, talks, co-authored papers, every aspect of the project has strived to build a transdisciplinary community and conversation as an open and democratized discourse. We believe that a lack of literacy on a broad scope is a crucial factor in the slow cultural, political, and corporate reaction to a monumental threat. Additionally significant is the lack of common language between disparate disciplines. Expertism creates barriers. The siloing of disciplines is not a new problem, and this hurdle figures greatly in the conceptual underpinnings of our work. Here we will look at a seminal work in the canon of transdisciplinary practice, The Two Cultures by C.P. Snow. Snow warns of the danger in the continued siloing language that he is observing in both the humanities and the sciences in 1959. He argues that real advances in human culture will require a common language and literacy between the fields. This, in many ways, parallels the goals of our work to push the boundary of these two fields and create literacy. The metaphor we use to describe our quest for a truly interdisciplinary practice is mutualism, appropriately borrowed from ecology. Quote, mutualism is a relationship between two organisms of different species which contribute mutually to each other's well-being. Commonly known as symbiosis in the biological sciences, the idea has extended to the complementary dependencies in social systems and eufunctional social processes. End quote. A well-known example of this kind of mutually beneficial relationship between organisms is the partnership between nitrogen-fixing bacteria and legume plants. The roots of the legume have evolved to include pockets that act as a refuge for the bacteria. These bacteria then convert nitrogen gas into fertilizing ammonia, and in turn, the plant provides an accessible form of carbon to its partner. Ecosystems emerge from larger scales, complexities, and groups of species. The ideal of Turbidity Paintings is the discovery of a new shared language that will dissolve silos at many levels and appropriately propel the creation of an ecosystem as a metaphor forward. Art is a particularly good agent to scaffold a transdisciplinary and cross-expertise discourse through the language of image, form, and the phenomenological. We originally proposed that collecting images from a procedural message would produce art installations that would also simultaneously exist as a database. The concept of using photography to create a baseline longitudinal study is a respected methodology. Many contemporary artists have recently conducted research and fieldwork with this method. For example, Christian Aslan returns to the locations of historic documents in order to re-photograph the changed glacier landscape in his work with the Norwegian Polar Institute. Aslan's careful reenactments construct compositions that reveal a sobering truth about a rapidly changing planet. The evidence is striking. The photos evoke a phenomenological or visual intelligence about the natural circumstances. The photographs operate as a surrogate for human visual perception and collapse distances in a way that abstractions like language, mathematics, and charting just cannot. The artwork functions powerfully through this context. The discourse between the images is like a shot to the solar plexus, quickly evoking consciousness of striking changes. The visual comprehension of an actual place is a more powerful experience than reams of evidence available as data, graphs, or analogy.
Merleau-Ponty's primacy of perception is a theoretical construct we often use to frame our work. If, as Merleau-Ponty observes, all consciousness is the result of perception, then consciousness requires a direct experience to arouse a deeper and perhaps even intuitive sensibility of the universe, what we refer to as visual intelligence. Merleau-Ponty's theory that all consciousness flows from experience could also explain the reason why scientists are more able to make leaps of awareness from abstract sources like data. Perhaps researchers have developed a persistent construct of consciousness from hours and years of experience in the field observing phenomena. In this construct, the symbolic language of data combined with memory have melded into a seamless representation of the real. However, while scientists have this built-in experience, which allows them to connect to charts, the disconnect comes when trying to translate and communicate the charted information to a public that lacks that experience. Therefore, the vast public fails to connect and creates a void in which the artist attempts to fill. Art theory, visual intelligence, is an observational and critical methodology that scaffolds perceptual experience in addition to compelling metaphor and discursive artifacts like painting and sculptures that artists create. We use similar observational methods in the Turbidity Paintings project. This was heavily influenced by an environmental science method called a Secchi disk. Turbidity is the clarity of the water. A Secchi disk is a circular plane divided quarterly in black and white and connected to a rope. The disk is lowered until it drops out of sight, and those depths are recorded as data. There are multiple factors that might influence the reading that have nothing to do with the turbidity of the water. These might include, of course, atmospheric ambience, sea surface conditions, and the visual acuity of the person taking the measurements. And yet, this is a standard data point recognized for over 150 years despite the relative and qualitative nature. The Secchi disk demonstrates science as a visual intelligence. It overlaps with a fundamental definition of art, the active attempt to see or experience. The Secchi disk provides us the foundation for a methodology to create hybrids of art and data. The concept that the images would also simultaneously be data was critical to the project, as it pushes back against the separation of art and science such as C.P. Snow argued for. Our process eventually settled on a camera and a dolly made from PVC. The equipment is lowered into the water and with a diver to operate the camera. At each research station, photographs are taken at standard distances from a backdrop. The realities of going on research cruises with the dive staff and collaborating with bioscientists brought on some personal experiential moments for me. These can only be described as deeply phenomenological. June 2016. I floated face down on the Escambia River just off the stern of a University of West Florida 23-foot V-hull boat. The biologists on board were dipping bottles and dropping probes scant yards from me, but I heard nothing except my breath, wheezing and whistling through a cheap snorkel. The sun was high and to my back. My scuba mask face pointed downward into a bronzy abyss, in the channel between the grasses. It was a spiritual haze, golden translucent. I cast a soft shadow in the glowing murk. My heart beat faster. Damn it, I cursed loudly in my thoughts. Once a painter, always a painter. The image of the bronze-like river haze to the aquamarine transparency of stations at the mouth of Gulf of Mexico had entranced me and encouraged me the continued collection of images. The colors mixing under the water, from light reflecting the mixing with dissolved solids, and the color of the backdrop create a mosaic that are both painting and data. This spiritual experience may not only be poetic. Colors, in fact, may be critical data. The images that I captured were 20 million pixels, or points of color, per image. Consider that in any stop I took 4 images per background, and that there are 4 backgrounds total. Add to this, the process was repeated 6 times or more for oversampling. Thus, my activity at any single research station recorded a minimum of 1.9 billion points of color data.
At the UWF laboratories, the images are run through a program to count how many occurrences of each RGB color combination are in each discrete digital photo. Initial studies have produced data that correlates to different conditions of biochemistry and bacteria counts to particular color combinations. Again, it is important to stress that these are correlating data points like the Secchi. But the first data suggests that you can correlate certain bacterial counts and other geochemical properties from the RGB profiles of the images. We hold the provocative speculation that color phenomenon may hold layers of embedded information that we have not recognized yet. The color would then allow us to ascribe physical characteristics that reinforce affected responses to the spectrum as visual intelligence. The animal world is rife with correlations like toxicity in bright colors on species with poisonous skin. The question then becomes something like, is the ruddy brown in a red tide or the yellow-green of chlorine gas nature's signal for toxicity? In 2018, research from the Vancouver Prostate Centre at the University of British Columbia began validating the toxicity of compounds by image analysis, not chemical analysis. Their question was, can they find a signature to the toxicity from simply running analysis of an image? The team analyzed histograms for basic color channels to see if they can model a correlation to toxicity. Another and more well-known project is the image analysis of forests being conducted using aerial photography. Ecologist Greg Asmuth uses a spectrometer and a high-powered lasers to map nature. His survey techniques allow for image analysis to determine and extrapolate the movement of harmful insects or other disease vectors by analysis of aerial imaging. Often this is tied to spectral analysis. It would follow that color can be taken as correlating indicators for other forms of broad and generalized knowledge, a holistic indicator, a visual intelligence that is easily understood. In conclusion, we live in an age of ecological crisis and cynicism. And furthermore, it is imperative now more than ever that art combats the divisiveness that exists. Art plays a fundamental role as a witness to record and collapse the distance for an individual to develop an understanding of humanity's place in the world. Our hybrid practices use these methods and seek a greater understanding. Our belief is that the transdisciplinary language of image and the power of phenomenology can create a common language which disrupts the apathy induced by overwhelming complexities of the crisis. This hybrid of art science practice is an intelligence driven by a visuality that is co-indicated by measurement and therefore transcends the limits of expertise.
On behalf of Sara and myself, thank you very much for the invitation to present.